Welcome back, everyone, to another reaction video. Well, I am excited to go back and revisit a little bit of Sabaton history. We haven't done this for a while. Love Indy Nidell. I love how he presents a story and tells history. If you haven't checked out some of the Sabaton history videos, I'll put a link to the playlists down below. But also check out the stuff he's done for the Great War channel, which is just really good. And we'll get into that at some point, but it's a lot to digest. I think once I get a little closer to my trip to France, coming in January, then we'll probably visit some of the Great War stuff so we can kind of cover that before I hit those battlefields. So we're going to dive into CAROLUS Rex today, since we did so much with the Great Northern War, that extra credit series, which I will also put a link in the description to that series. I thought it would be really cool to dive into a little bit more of the history of Charles the 12th, or Karl the 12th of Sweden. I learned some of his story by way of Sabaton history. So here we go.
He was the king who inspired an album.
Actually, two.
The king who inspired two albums.
CAROLUS Rex.
The history of Sweden is in many ways the story of her kings. Since the founding...
Wait. What are you wearing, Indy? Okay, hey, to each his own. It reminds me a little bit of the puffy shirt on Seinfeld, if you remember that episode. Anyway.
Of the modern Swedish kingdom, with the reign of Gustav Vasa and his magnificent beard, the course was set by the will of the monarchy. Breaking free of the shackles of the mighty Denmark, Swedish kings subsequently sought to enlarge Swedish might, with dreams of a new Scandinavian empire, a Dominium Maris Baltici, in the north of Europe and across the Baltic Sea. Sweden realized its imperial dreams and expanded its borders towards Estonia and Livonia, and established a strong Swedish presence on the northern coastline. This, of course, attracted the attention of equally ambitious neighbors. And as it always was with the dreams of mighty dynasties and noble houses, their ambitions were soon accompanied by conflict, competition, and war.
So, you know, the Baltics are such an interesting place because it's the meeting place. First of all, it's on the sea, so it's, you know, access to the sea is everything, especially if you're an otherwise landlocked country. Now, Russia is not landlocked, the Tsardom of Russia at this time, but they don't have access to the Baltic Sea. They've only got access, you know, down in the south of the Black Sea. So that's a big point of contention. That's a place that an expanding empire wants to be. You've also got the Poland-Lithuanian Commonwealth that kind of encroaches into there. So you've got Sweden coming down, you've got Poland, Lithuania coming up from the southwest, and then you've got Russia coming in from the southeast. And so this is like, it's kind of like the powder keg of Europe, the Balkans, where you've got the Ottomans and you've got Christian Europe and, you know, the Austro-Hungarians later on and things like that. So really interesting and fascinating time and place in history.
Each Swedish king inherited the enemies and animosities of the past. Sweden had already crossed swords with the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and with Russia, but it would be King Gustavus Adolphus' involvement in the 30 Years' War that set the empire on what would be a downward spiral in the long run. Although he would be the lion from the north, the savior and champion of Protestantism, his religious crusade had reshackled Sweden to a foreign cause.
And we've talked about the 30 Years' War some in the past. 30 Years' War is this incredibly devastating war in Europe. I mean, the numbers involved are just, you know, for a war that I think maybe in Europe you guys learn a lot more about that, but I know for me in the United States growing up, 30 Years' War is just not something we really talked about at all. I can't remember. And I loved history, and I just don't remember talking about it. But this was really consequential and a really devastating war.
This time to that of German kings and dukes. With her commitment to the war in the Holy Roman Empire, Sweden missed her historical chance to build an empire on the Neva, and instead made powerful enemies. Denmark, Poland, Russia, Saxony, and Brandenburg were all soon eyeing Swedish expansion with increasing suspicion, waiting for a chance to pounce. Sweden's historical weakness was her place on the map, and the overseas possessions outside of Scandinavia.
So here you can see what I was talking about earlier. Here's the area we're talking about. There's the access to the Baltic Sea right here. Finland doesn't exist yet. I mean, it's marked on the map so that we know where it is today. But at this time, it's part of Sweden. You got Norway over here. And so you can see where they're at. It is a really precarious spot. You know, their southern border is right there with Denmark. You've got their western border with Norway. You've got Prussia right here. You've got Saxony over here. And you've got Russia here, and then the Poland-Lithuanian Commonwealth in here. So, yeah, I mean, they're just in a bad spot.
Were a nearly impossible task to defend. Sweden could field a mighty modern army, sure, but its population was small, and the economy was reliant on highly competitive maritime trade, so Sweden was vulnerable. One political misstep, one fatal defeat on the battlefield, and the empire could be shaken apart. In many ways, it was a colossus on feet of clay.
That's a really good point, a colossus on feet of clay. When you've got a strong army and you're doing well, as long as you don't get dragged into a long war. I mean, because that's the one thing Sweden can't do, is to get dragged into a long, protracted war of attrition, because they just don't have the manpower for that. They've got a professional army that, you know, if you get into a fight and you win like one or two quick battles, like fight a war less than a year, and you can win an overwhelming victory on the battlefield, that's the ideal situation for Sweden, and they're built for that. They're not built for a long war, and that's what we see happen in the Great Northern War. As it goes on for 20 years. They just can't sustain that.
The second half of the 17th century brought these weaknesses to light. As Sweden's enemies backed her into a corner, more and more the nation had to rely on the wisdom and the courage of its kings and the strength of its armies to keep it alive. Notably King Charles XI, Karl den Elfte, who through ruthless land reclamation laws revitalized the country, rebuilt the army, and established a military caste that was deeply loyal to the king.
And he mentioned there about the reclamation laws. So this is one of the most powerful absolute monarchies in Europe at this time. Trying to think, France is probably still an absolute monarchy at this point. England is not. By this point, what you're dealing with is this is the aftermath of the English Civil War. So the power of the English kings is starting to wane. You're getting very close to the Glorious Revolution, where you're going to have William and Mary. The last of the Stuart monarchs is coming, and then you're going to get into the Hanoverian monarchs later on. So yeah, Sweden's got this powerful absolute monarchy, which is great as long as you have good kings. And what Sweden needs more than anything right now is diplomacy. They can't have enemies everywhere. You've got to have allies.
With tireless ambition, he saved Sweden from the brink of collapse, but in doing so, he allowed Sweden's monarchy to become one of the most absolute in all of Europe. On June 17, 1682, his heir was born. Named after his father, the young Prince Karl soon proved himself to be a child full of promise and potential.
That's such a great painting, and I'm guessing that was probably made later in his life, because like it looks like him in the face. You can recognize right away that's who that is.
His strong, stubborn character both impressed and unnerved those around him. It was said that once Karl made a promise to himself or to others, he would never stray from fulfilling it. If he was set to a task, it was nearly impossible to dissuade him from achieving his goal. Karl's father had lived a Spartan life, one that his son would imitate. The king had rejected every sort of luxury and regarded sloth and frivolity as the greatest sins a man could have.
Which sloth is considered, like in earlier times in the Catholic Church, you talk about the 7 deadly sins, and sloth, or laziness basically, is one of those 7 deadly sins.
Taught his prince to be a merciless lion to his enemy and a generous lamb to his own people. But it would be Karl's mother, Ulrika Leonora, who taught her son the values of honor, piety, and charity. Although he would be a king to his people one day, in front of God he was just a simple man, a sinner like everyone else. Karl is said to have prayed at least twice a day and never missed religious service in his life, even in the field. In a way, King Karl XI was to his son what Philip II of Macedon had been to Alexander the Great. He left his prince a strong and stable state, a full treasury, and a mighty army. Karl XI died in 1697 of stomach cancer, and young Karl, just 15 years old, ascended to the throne as Karl den Tolfte, Karl XII. Historians do debate whether he was too young for the throne, for like most 15-year-olds, he was adventurous and impatient.
So 15's like right at that age where it could go either way. If you were too young to be considered able to rule in your own right, you would have, like in England, they had a Lord Protector who was basically a regent who would rule on your behalf until you were old enough. And what would often happen is that those regents, those protectors, would try to hang on to that power as long as possible until the king got to that place where he was old enough to kind of step up and say, nope, you're done, I'm taking my power. And so for Karl XII, he comes to the throne at 15, and for a headstrong, bold kind of leader like this, he's not going to wait around. He's going to take the throne right then and there.
Once he rode through Stockholm at breakneck speed, smashing every window with his sword. Would a few more years of guidance by his father have helped him become a better statesman? Still, the many schemers and foreign diplomats who sought to exploit the boy king for their own advantage were soon to be deeply disappointed. Karl stared them down with an inscrutable poker face, betraying no sign of weakness or insecurity. His naturally frigid temperament and his taciturnity were his best shield in the first months of his reign. But despite his youth, Karl had clear ideas about how to run the show. Unlike other kings before him, the estates had to swear their oath of allegiance to him not after, but before his coronation. Karl would not ask for their obedience, nor would he make any concessions to his rule.
So the significance of that, the coronation is considered to be that moment where the king gets anointed. It's kind of the recognition of his legitimacy. It's the bestowing upon him of that recognition. And so what he's saying by saying, you have to do it to me even before my coronation, is he's establishing that he's already been given that right to rule by birth and by divine right. And it doesn't have to be granted to him by the state.
His authority was to be absolute and not linked to obligations or promises to those who were subjugated to him by natural order. On the day of his coronation, he ordered the members of the parliament to walk on foot towards the ceremony. Only he, the soon-to-be king, clad in full royal regalia, was to be welcomed by the church on horseback. Inside the sanctuary, Karl climbed a high throne, draped in golden cloth and scarlet damask, and took his seat on a chair of silver. By the grace of God, he was anointed king, Carolus Rex. After the sermon, he knelt
Carolus Rex is just Latin for Charles the King.
Silent prayer. He would answer to God, as his mother had taught him, but on this earth, no one was his superior. So he took over the burdens and responsibilities of the kingdom in God's name and would lead as he saw fit. And absolute his reign would be. Karl would enter Parliament and interrupt whenever he liked. When he was present, others were only allowed to speak in whispers, and Karl had no qualms about openly reprimanding his chancellor. If it came to his ears that someone had refused his commands or spoken ill of his reign, his ire could be merciless. Even from the farthest corners of the country, dissidents were dragged back to Stockholm in chains, and if found guilty, were sentenced to life in prison or the firing squad. It seemed like Sweden was in for a rough ride, with absolute power manifesting in the hands of the boy king, who was not particularly fond of opposition.
Kind of a boy king, but at 15, especially in the 17th century, I mean, if you're in any other role besides being a king, you're pretty much a man at that point.
But despite his harsh demeanor, Karl was not the evil tyrant that he is often portrayed as. Quite the contrary. His character had a humane side, one in line with the ideals of enlightenment. He forbade torture and vowed to judge those around him based on personal merit. He demanded that every Swede do his duty to the state, but every bit of hardship beyond that was forbidden. Karl treated those loyal to him with a hearty respect and valued their commitment to him with benevolence and rewarding gratitude. The first year of his reign had a sobering effect on the young king. Karl, who had romanticized the duties of the monarchy, grew tired of the endless line of ambassadors and ministers constantly pleading for his judgment. The domestic, peaceful life of everyday state affairs had no appeal to him, and while he cared deeply for the well-being of his mother and sister, he otherwise did not seek the company of women.
So what you really kind of get the sense of about this king is that he really was most comfortable in the saddle at war. Everything else almost seemed like just kind of a nuisance that he had to deal with so that he could go to war. You know, some people are just that way. They're just kind of built for certain things, and he was built for war. And anything that was going to get in the way of him being able to do what he was most comfortable with was just kind of a nuisance to him, and that included women, it seems.
Instead, Karl sought adventure, danger, and hardship. He was a born soldier and dreamed of greatness, of the glory that his ancestors had brought to Sweden, and of a chance to prove himself. At the turn of the 18th century, the dark clouds of war once more gathered over Europe. In the south, dynasties were arming themselves for the coming Spanish War of Succession. In the north, the old enemy Denmark was forging alliances with Poland and Russia, preparing to invade Holstein. Wherever Sweden turned, it would find enemies to fight, and Karl eyed Europe with the impatient gaze of a hungry lion. War was an opportunity for Sweden to return to greatness by rightful conquest. In February 1700, Saxon troops marched into Livonia. The Danes invaded Holstein, and Russia set its sights on the Baltic provinces.
Russia wants a port on the Baltic Sea, and this is where they're going to establish what will become St. Petersburg, which is their great, capital city. And that's in land that at the beginning of this war, they don't even occupy.
Be called the Great Northern War began. Karl heard of the news during a bear hunt. At once he returned to Stockholm, entered the parliament, and declared, "I have resolved never to begin an unrighteous war, but I have also resolved never to finish a righteous war until I have utterly crushed my enemies." With these words, Carolus Rex set out to fight his enemies and decide Sweden's future on the battlefield. The young king, absolute in his power, was to confront a coalition of enemies. His army was one of the best in Europe, a deadly tool in the hands of a skillful commander.
Very powerful, very effective, but not very deep. So you got to hang on to the soldiers you've got because there's not a huge reserve. These are well-trained professional soldiers that toe-to-toe with any army in the world could probably win, but they can't win if they get into a battle of attrition.
But to safeguard the Swedish Empire, it was not enough for Karl to win a battle or two. He had to improve Sweden's strategic position, or it would be all for naught. With this in mind, he crossed the Sound like his personal Rubicon. There would be no turning back. Now, Per, you said he inspired 2 albums.
Yes, because the CAROLUS Rex album is available in English and Swedish.
Aha. So it is 2 albums. And now, something I got to ask you. You are a Swede, and I am actually now a Swedish dual citizenship.
Oh, cool.
So I'm a Swede as well, but I didn't grow up there.
Ta-da!
Yeah, hey, thank you.
They put a little
Can you
Swedish
tell
flag.
them what Carolus Rex means to Swedes? Because many of the South American or Asian people might not have any idea.
Yeah, and it actually is quite difficult every time I explain it because it doesn't make much sense. But okay, Carolus Rex is a Swedish king.
Yep.
Who was involved in the Swedish Empire time in history.
As we've seen.
And he is the lead figure of our album Carolus Rex,
Yep.
of course. But he's considered a very controversial character in Sweden. Not because of what he historically did, but what he has become
right.
in later times when he has become a symbol of neo-Nazism.
And see, this is so frustrating in history that people do this kind of thing. That they take people and make them figures of an ideology that has nothing at all to do with it. I mean, you're going to take a guy who was king in the early 1700s and you're going to turn him into a neo-Nazi figurehead? Oh, that's so frustrating that has to be the case.
And right-wing extremists.
And hyper-nationalism.
Yeah. And this doesn't go very well because obviously neo-Nazism was not invented in the 17th century.
Yeah.
And also the king of Carolus Rex was quite multicultural and this. So it's a bit controversial how it went down.
Yeah.
And this resulted in when we presented the idea, we're going to do an album about Carolus Rex. People immediately start to think, oh, you're going to do a neo-Nazi album. No, we're going to do a historical album about a king.
Come on, here's the thing, and this is why it's so important that we understand history, real history, not what people spin it to be, because this shouldn't even be an issue. That people, this is a matter of ignorance. This is ignorance by people who don't know their history and who hear something and believe it to be true without studying for themselves. There's no reasonable person who should look at the story of Karl XII and think it has anything to do with neo-Nazism. But people make it that, and then people who are ignorant of history believe it. Don't fall for that stuff.
17th century in Sweden. Yeah. But there were people who warned us, do not do this. Yeah. It's going to ruin your career because you're going to be considered neo-Nazis and you're going to be considered fascists and you're going to be considered all kind of things. And we said, we will do it because we are Sabaton and we sing about historical facts. And this is historical,
good for them.
About a Swedish king in the 17th century. Good. And we have nothing...
So we're going to do it because it's the right thing that we want to do. It has nothing to do with that stupid crap you guys believe. Suck it up and deal with it. Good for them for standing for that.
To do with it was not us who decided that he's gonna be a symbol of right wing in 300 years after his death.
I wonder how you would actually feel about that. But it's interesting you say that because when I started working with you, when we started talking about stuff a couple of years ago, I have a friend from Grist up in Dalarna, and he said, "You sure you want to work with the Sabaton guys?" I'm like, "Yeah, I met you guys. You're cool guys." And I knew the songs and the history. He's like, "But you know, it's supposed to be like have some connections with like neo-Nazi stuff." And I said, "No, they don't." Again, and
this brings me to a really, really good point, and this is something that a point that I make regularly in my job with Rachel's Challenge. When I speak in schools, like I did this past week in Pittsburgh, we give the students a number of challenges. And one of those challenges that we give, in fact, it's the first one, is to look for the best in other people. I'm getting a little off topic, but I want to share this. And at some point, maybe I'll do some videos on this on their own. Rachel Scott, whose story that I share, who's the girl that my daughter's named after, her brother Craig was... a student at Columbine, and he was in the library, which is where most of the shooting took place that day at Columbine. He was hiding under a table in the library with two of his buddies, and one of those buddies was a kid named Isaiah Scholes, who was one of the very few African-American students at Columbine. It was an overwhelmingly white school. Isaiah got taunted by the two shooters with racial slurs for the last seconds of his life before he was murdered. And that hate is something we share that with students as a way of introducing the idea that, listen, you can't prejudge people. You have to take the time to get to know people. Don't judge people based on what you see, based on the color of their skin, based on how they dress, based on who they voted for even. You know, a lot of people do that now with politics. We automatically see them, oh, you voted for that person, you support that person, therefore you support all this other stuff too. And it works on both sides. Take every person as an individual. That's what Dr. Martin Luther King talked about when he said, we judge people by the content of their character. So with that said, same thing here with Sabaton. I'm so glad he mentioned that because he heard things. People said, oh, those guys support neo-Nazis. And he's like, no, I've gotten to know these guys. I know that's not what they're about. Take the time to get to know people. Don't just believe whatever you hear. Don't just take somebody else's word for it. See past the crap and get to know somebody's character. And then make a judgment. And then at that point, if you judge them to be one thing or the other, that's fine. But take the time to get to know them first.
Definitely is 100% because of CAROLUS Rex. And also because you released a version in Swedish as well. You know?
Which adds to the whole thing of nationalism and these things. And it's easy to be do it in a conspiracy thinking that Sabaton is doing this in order to... I don't know what all kind of people do, but it was pretty interesting. So when we released the album, we had a lot of that people were going mental about it. Yeah. There were people who shouting, "I'm never gonna listen to this fascist band again," and things like that. And we were expecting some things like this to happen, and but there was a few moments when we actually like. enjoy this attention as well. I remember there's an interview.
Well, I will say this. When that stuff happens, there's an opportunity there. There's an opportunity. It's a teaching moment. It's a chance to set people straight. It's a chance to, when the focus is on you, to be able to speak out and say, listen, this is not what we're supporting, and that's not what this guy's story is even about.
With a Swedish journalist who came with an agenda only to destroy Sabaton.
Okay.
And he faced a very angry Joachim.
Yeah.
And
I would not want to face a very angry Joachim. I'm not a big dude anyway. I'm not very strong or tough, but I just feel like he would eat me if he wanted to.
He comes with accusations that has nothing to do with Sabaton at all.
Okay.
And the journalist comes without having any knowledge. He's as educated as a person, I don't know, who spent zero, who never went to a historical class.
Well, why would...
Facing Joachim. In this, and accusing Joachim. And Joachim destroyed him so much that this article was never, you couldn't publish it. The journalist was so embarrassed about it and had no more ammunition. And it's kind of,
Good.
Us spending, at this time, 10 years singing about history of wars and stuff, and then you come and try to accuse us of having an agenda or something like that. When we are in that mood, we have quite a lot of experience of talking, and I do a lot of interviews. In a regular year, I would do 400 interviews.
Wow.
So if you come and you try to come and lecture me of what we can and cannot do in terms of Sabaton, we have the ammunition to
have the truth on your side.
We don't need to, but if
you
come with that approach to us, we have the ammunition to take out. And if you challenge us on our battlefield, you're gonna go down a very bad lane. That's for sure.
I can picture that journalist not realizing that. I can see angry Joachim. Let's get a picture of Joachim. Okay, look at Joachim. Can you picture him angry? And it's like a bear, and the journalist is poking him with a stick and stuff just to see what happens.
Don't do it.
But how can you not prepare for an interview? Like if you're the journalist going to talk to you guys about it, how could he not have done? That's what journalists are supposed to do. Research.
I get some of this every so often too, and not necessarily accusations of being a fascist or anything like that, but I'll get comments from people who think that they've got a gotcha moment. They're like, well, actually, and they'll try to correct something I've said, only to be completely wrong. And I'll say, hey, could you provide? I try to handle it really well. I get irritated occasionally, and listen, there are plenty of times people correct me, and I am wrong. And I will acknowledge that. If you guys come to me with facts and say, hey, you misspoke here, or you said something wrong, I will always acknowledge that, and I will always welcome that. I'm all about the truth. I'm all about getting it right, and I will get it wrong. I'm doing these reactions off the top of my head without really preparing or anything in most cases. So occasionally I'm going to remember something wrong, or I'm going to get something mixed up, and when that needs correcting, it'll be corrected. But when people come at me with like a gotcha moment, I'll usually say, hey, because I'll first look it up, and if I'm pretty sure I'm still right, I'll say, could you just provide me with some evidence of that, with some sources? And 9 times out of 10, they'll be like, sorry, I guess I was wrong. But other times they'll double down, and it just never goes well when they do that.
First the topic before talking to the person they're interviewing, so they know what they're talking about.
In this case, he was prepared in the wrong way.
Yeah.
Not by any historical facts. But by only the angle of that you have just done something that should be racist.
Right. And according to these people, it should be racist.
Yeah.
If you are a journalist in the future and you're going to be interviewing the guys in Sabaton, particularly about historical events, you may want to do a little research ahead of time so you know something about those historical events and can put them into a relevant context when you're talking to these guys that spend their entire life writing about those things and learning.
They know what they're talking about.
So keep that in mind for future episodes of Sabaton History.
All right. Thanks, guys, so much. I hope you enjoyed that. Check out some of the links in the description. I also put a link to the original content. Check out the Sabaton History channel. Fantastic stuff if you're into their music or just want to learn more about historic events in 10, 15-minute bites. Thanks for watching. We'll see you again soon.